You ever watch someone dial 911 on you and realize halfway through they just made the worst mistake of their life? The bass was low but steady, vibrating through the concrete floor of my garage like a second heartbeat, the kind you feel in your boots more than your ears, mixing with the smell of motor oil, grilled burgers, and cheap beer sweating in a cooler by the workbench, neon light washing over chrome tools and polished steel like something out of a mechanic's daydream. And for a moment, everything felt exactly right, controlled, measured, intentional. The way I like it, because nothing in this garage happens by accident. Not the wiring, not the sound levels, not even the way the cars are angled just enough to keep the driveway clear and within HOA parking limits. I checked all of it twice, maybe 3 times. Decibel app open on my phone earlier reading a comfortable 62. While under the county's 70 limit after 9 p.m., cars spaced exactly 18 inches from the curb, no blocked sidewalks, no violations, nothing she could use against me, because Linda Crawford doesn't need much, just an excuse. And for the past 6 months, I'd been her favorite project, the guy with the open garage, the wrong kind of friends, the wrong kind of independence, the one house on the block that didn't fold every time she waved a clipboard. I could still hear her voice from last week, sharp enough to cut through a running engine, telling me this wasn't that kind of neighborhood. Like she got to decide what kind of life people lived behind their own doors. And I remember just nodding, wiping grease off my hands, letting her talk, because arguing with people like Linda is like revving an engine in neutral, loud, pointless, and going nowhere. But tonight was different. Tonight I wasn't reacting, I was waiting, because I knew her patterns, the way she'd circle in that white Lexus like a patrol unit, headlights crawling past my house, slowing just enough to confirm what she already believed, that I was the problem, and right on schedule. Right as someone laughed a little too loud, and the music hit a slightly deeper note, I saw those headlights pause again, longer this time, then disappear. And I didn't say anything, didn't change the music, didn't tell anyone to quiet down. I just took a slow sip from my bottle and glanced over at the far corner of the garage where he sat, quiet, almost blending into the shadows, nursing his drink like he had nowhere else to be. Denim jacket, calm eyes, the kind of posture you only see in men who've spent years being the calmest person in every room. He hadn't said much since he got here, just a nod when I handed him a beer, a small comment about the engine block on my lift, and then silence, watching, listening, and that was enough, because some people don't need to announce who they are. And about 3 minutes later, right on cue, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night air, faint at first, then growing, bouncing off the rows of identical houses like a warning echo, and someone near the fridge muttered, "You expecting company?" And I just smiled, set my bottle down on the workbench, and said, "Yeah, something like that." Because the truth was, I'd already done everything right, every measurement, every rule, every line she thought she could draw around me, and the only thing left for Linda Crawford to do was exactly what I knew she would. The first patrol car rolled in slow, tires crunching over the edge of the curb like it was testing the ground before committing, red and blue lights washing across the garage walls and pulses that turned chrome into flashes of fire and ice. And just like that, the music did not stop, but it softened. Conversations dipped, heads turned, and you could feel the shift, that subtle tightening in the air when authority shows up uninvited. One officer stepping out first, hand resting near his belt out of habit more than intent, scanning the scene with the kind of calm that comes from doing this 1,000 times before, and right behind him, like she had been waiting for her moment on stage, Linda Crawford appeared from the shadows of her perfectly trimmed hedges, phone still in her hand, posture straight, chin lifted, that same rehearsed concern painted across her face like she was about to give a statement on the evening news. And I could hear her heels clicking against the pavement as she closed the distance, every step sharp, deliberate, controlled. "Officers, thank God you are here," she said, voice sweet on the surface but tight underneath. "This has been going on for hours. Loud music, multiple vehicles. I believe alcohol is involved. It is completely out of control." And I almost laughed at the precision of it, the way she stacked her words like evidence, each one chosen to push the situation just a little further than reality, because that is what Linda does. She does not just complain. She constructs. She builds a version of events that sounds official enough to become real if nobody challenges it. And for a second, the younger officer glanced toward me, then back at her, like he was trying to decide which version of the night he had just walked into. And I stayed exactly where I was, leaning lightly against the workbench, hands visible, relaxed, not defensive, not aggressive, just present, because everything about this moment depended on that, on not giving her anything extra to work with. "Sir, we're going to need you to step outside and talk with us," the older officer said, voice even, professional, and I nodded, slow, deliberate, like I had all the time in the world, stepping out from under the neon glow into the wash of patrol lights. The cool night air carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and hot engine metal, and I could feel Linda's eyes on me, waiting, expecting resistance, expecting frustration, expecting something she could point at and say, "See, I told you." But all she got was calm, and that seemed to irritate her more than anything. "We have received a complaint about excessive noise and a potentially unsafe gathering," the officer continued, and I could see the notebook already in his hand, pen ready, routine unfolding exactly the way it always does, question, answer, assessment. But before I even opened my mouth, Linda leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice like she was sharing something confidential. "He has been warned before," she added, just enough emphasis to try and tilt the scale, and that was when I realized something. She was not just calling the police tonight. She was trying to establish a pattern, build a record, create leverage, and that is when I let my eyes drift, just for a second, back toward the garage, toward the man still sitting quietly in the corner, untouched by the flashing lights, untouched by the tension, watching everything unfold with that same steady calm, and I felt that small, quiet certainty settle in my chest, the kind that does not rush, does not spike, just locks into place. Because Linda thought she had just escalated the situation to her advantage, but what she did not understand was that she had just brought the entire situation exactly where it needed to be. The officer flipped his notebook open with a quiet snap that seemed louder than the music still humming behind me, pen hovering for a second like he was deciding where this story was going to start, and I could feel Linda standing just off my shoulder, close enough that her perfume cut through the smell of oil and grilled meat, sharp and expensive, the kind of scent that tries too hard to say control. "How long has this gathering been going on tonight?" he asked, voice steady, eyes on me but aware of everything around us. And I gave him the truth, because the truth was the strongest position I had. "About 2 hours, small group, just friends, nothing over the local limit," I said, keeping my tone even, not defensive, not challenging, just factual, and he gave a small nod, writing it down, while the second officer moved a few steps closer to the garage, taking in the scene, counting bodies, checking spacing, the way trained eyes do without making a show of it, and I saw him glance at the speaker setup, then at the open driveway, then at the street, and nothing about his posture tightened, nothing about his stance shifted into concern, because there was nothing here that crossed a line, not legally, not structurally, not even close. But Linda was not done, not even close. "He is minimizing it," she said quickly, stepping forward half a pace, voice lifting just enough to pull attention back to her. "This has been a recurring issue, noise, traffic, disruption to the neighborhood. I have documented everything." And she tapped her phone like it was evidence in a courtroom, like this moment had been rehearsed in her head a dozen times. And maybe it had. Maybe she had been waiting for the right night, the right combination of sound and timing to make it feel real enough. But there was something in the officer's expression now, something subtle, a slight narrowing of the eyes, not suspicion toward me, but toward the situation itself, like he was starting to see the shape of it beyond the words. And that was when the second officer stepped back toward us, lowering his voice just enough to keep it professional but private. "Noise level seems within range," he said, almost as a side note. And that single sentence shifted the weight in the air, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. And I saw it hit Linda like a hairline crack in something she thought was solid, her smile tightening for just a second before she recovered, pushing forward again. "While there are also safety concerns," she added quickly, layering it on, building again, because she could feel it slipping. "Vehicles, alcohol, late hours. This is a residential community." And that was the moment the older officer paused, pen still, and looked past me, not at the cars, not at the speakers, but into the garage itself, deeper this time, eyes scanning beyond the obvious, and I followed that gaze without turning my head fully, just enough to see what he was seeing, the quiet figure in the corner, still seated, still calm, the glow of the neon light catching the edge of his profile, and something shifted again, sharper this time, more defined, like a recognition forming just out of reach, and I felt that same certainty settle in deeper, heavier now, because this was the point where control starts to move, not with noise, not with force, but with realization, and Linda kept talking, filling the space, unaware that the direction of this entire moment had already begun to turn. "I just want the neighborhood to be safe," she said, voice softening again, returning to that practiced concern. But the officer was no longer writing, no longer asking, just looking, processing, and I could see it building behind his eyes, that flicker of connection that changes everything, and I knew it was only a matter of seconds now before the truth in that garage stepped fully into the light. The older officer took one slow step forward, his boots barely making a sound against the concrete, but the shift in his posture said everything, like something had just clicked into place behind his eyes, and for the first time since they arrived, his attention moved past me completely, cutting through the noise, the lights, the tension, and landing directly on the man sitting in the corner of my garage, still calm, still unmoved, like none of this had anything to do with him. And for a second, there was silence, not the absence of sound, but the kind that forms when everyone subconsciously realizes something just changed, even if they cannot explain it yet. And I watched as the officer's expression tightened just slightly, not in suspicion, not in concern, but in recognition, the kind that carries weight, the kind that rewrites the entire situation without a single word being spoken. And Linda kept talking, still building her case, still trying to control the narrative, unaware that the ground beneath her version of events was already starting to give way. "I have emails, documentation, prior notices," she continued, voice steady, but just a fraction too fast now, like she could feel the shift without understanding it. And the officer did not respond to her, did not even look at her this time. His focus locked forward as he took another step, closer to the garage entrance, closer to the light. And that was when the man in the corner finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple motion, setting his bottle down on the edge of the workbench with a soft clink, the kind of sound that somehow carried more authority than anything Linda had said all night. And he stood up, slow, deliberate, unfolding to his full height, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, and the moment he stepped forward into the wash of red and blue light, everything snapped into place. The officer straightened almost instantly, posture shifting from casual to formal without hesitation, like muscle memory taking over before thought could catch up. "Sir," he said, voice changing in a way that could not be mistaken, sharper, respectful, controlled. And that single word hit Linda harder than anything else, because confusion flickered across her face. Real confusion now, not the rehearsed kind. Her eyes darting between the officer and the man she had completely overlooked, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed. And the man gave a small nod, acknowledging the officer without making a show of it, like this kind of recognition was routine, expected. "Evening," he replied, voice calm, measured, carrying just enough weight to settle the space around it. And I could feel it then, that full shift, not loud, not explosive, just absolute, the kind that happens when authority reveals itself without needing to announce it. And the second officer turned fully now, attention locked in, the notebook forgotten at his side, and Linda took a half step back without realizing it, her confidence stalling mid-sentence, because whatever script she had written in her head for tonight did not include this, did not account for the fact that the person she had been trying to escalate against was not just me, not just a neighbor she could manage or pressure, but someone standing quietly in my garage who operated on a completely different level of the system she thought she understood. And for the first time since the siren started, she had nothing to say, just silence, wide eyes, and the slow realization that this situation was no longer hers to control. The air shifted in a way you cannot fake, like the entire scene had been quietly handed over to someone else without a single announcement. And Chief Daniel Hayes did not raise his voice, did not step forward like he owned the place. He just stood there under the wash of patrol lights, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady, and somehow that was enough to reset everything. The older officer straightened another inch, shoulders squared, attention locked, "Sir, we did not know you were here," he said, tone measured but unmistakably deferential, and Hayes gave a small nod. Nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. Like this was routine, like moments like this happened more often than people realized. And then his gaze moved, slow and deliberate, from the officer to Linda. And that was where the real pressure landed. Because now she was no longer performing for authority. She was standing directly in front of it. And you could see it in the way her posture shifted, just slightly. The confidence that had carried her through the call, through the complaint, through the first few minutes of control, starting to thin out under the weight of something she could not redirect. "Ma'am," Hayes said, calmly, voice even, not loud, not aggressive, just precise. "Can you explain the nature of your emergency call tonight?" And the word emergency seemed to hang there for a second longer than everything else, like it mattered more than the rest, and Linda opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I reported a disturbance," she said, voice softer now, less certain. Loud music, multiple vehicles, potential safety concerns, and Hayes did not interrupt, did not challenge her mid-sentence. He just listened, eyes steady, giving her the space to finish, because that is how real authority works. It does not rush, it does not need to. And when she stopped, he glanced once toward the garage, taking in the same details the officers had already seen. The spacing, the volume, the calm, then back to her. "And at any point did you observe behavior that posed an immediate threat to safety?" he asked, still calm, still neutral. And that was where it started to unravel, because now the question was not about preference or annoyance. It was about definition, about the difference between discomfort and actual emergency. And Linda hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "Well, I was concerned that it could escalate," she said, reaching for something, anything. But Hayes gave a slight nod, cutting gently but firmly through the attempt. "Concern is not the same as an active emergency, ma'am," he replied, voice steady, and the officers beside him remained silent, watching, learning. Because this was no longer a routine call. This was instruction happening in real time, and I stayed where I was, quiet, letting it unfold, because there was nothing I needed to add, nothing I needed to prove. Everything was already here. And Hayes continued, "Dispatch resources are prioritized for immediate needs. False or exaggerated reports can divert response from situations where people actually require assistance." And there it was, not an accusation, not yet, but a line drawn clearly enough that everyone understood it. And Linda's grip tightened slightly on her phone, her eyes flicking between the chief and the officers, searching for a way to regain footing. But there was none, not here, not anymore. Because the moment she made that call, she thought she was escalating power in her favor, but what she actually did was bring the highest level of accountability directly to her front step. And now every word she had used, every detail she had stretched, was being measured against reality by someone who did not need to guess. You could almost hear the shift happening inside her head, the way silence stretched just a second too long before she tried to fill it. The way her shoulders pulled tighter as if posture alone could rebuild authority that was already slipping through her fingers. And for the first time since she stepped into the driveway, Linda Crawford did not sound like the person in control. "I was acting in the best interest of the community," she said, voice steadier than her expression, like she was clinging to a script that had always worked before. And Chief Hayes did not interrupt, did not dismiss her. He simply held eye contact long enough for the weight of that statement to settle on its own, then gave a small, measured nod. "Community interest is important," he replied, calm, precise, "but it does not override proper use of emergency services." And the distinction landed clean, no raised tone, no edge, just clarity, the kind that leaves no room to twist meaning. And beside him, the older officer shifted his stance slightly, pen still in hand, but now writing again, documenting, not investigating anymore, but recording. And that subtle change said everything about where this situation was headed. And Linda saw it. You could see her eyes flick down to the notebook, then back up, recalculating, searching for a way to step back without admitting. "Ground lost. I have filed multiple reports about this property," she added quickly, pushing forward again. "There is a pattern of behavior." And Hayes listened, letting her finish, then turned his head just slightly toward me. Have you received any formal citations or violations from the city regarding noise or safety concerns? He asked, and I shook my head once, steady. No, sir, I said. Simple, direct. And he nodded again, like he already knew the answer, then looked back to Linda. Documentation matters, but so does accuracy, he said, tone unchanged. And now there was a quiet edge to it. Not sharp, not aggressive, but firm enough to hold its line. Repeated calls that do not meet the threshold for emergency response can be reviewed as misuse of the system. And there it was, not a threat, not a warning wrapped in volume, just a statement of process. The kind that carries consequences without needing to name them outright. And Linda's hand tightened around her phone again. Her confidence now reduced to small, controlled movements, her voice lower, more careful. I did not intend to misuse anything, she said, and Hayes gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without validating it. Intent is considered, he replied, but so is impact, and the officer beside him paused his writing just long enough to glance up, then back down, continuing. Because this was no longer a question of what happened, it was a record of it, and I stayed quiet, letting the moment breathe, because everything that needed to be said was already unfolding in front of me. The structure she had relied on, the assumptions she had built, all being measured against something real for the first time. And Hayes shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just enough to signal the conversation was reaching its end. At this time, there is no observed violation, he said clearly, for everyone present to hear, not just Linda, but the officers, the neighbors. Watching from behind curtains, the small circle of friends still standing in my garage, this gathering remains within legal limits. And that was it, clean, final, undeniable, and the silence that followed was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, like the outcome had already been decided long before the sirens ever arrived. And Linda stood there, no longer directing anything, no longer shaping the narrative, just present in a moment she could not control, realizing too late that the call she made to assert power had done the exact opposite. It had exposed the difference between having authority on paper and standing in front of the real thing. The words hung in the air like a final stamp on a document that nobody could appeal. And for a few seconds nobody moved. Not the officers, not the small group behind me, not even Linda, who just stood there with that frozen expression, like her mind was still trying to catch up to what had already been decided. And then Chief Hayes shifted his attention slightly, not away from her, but outward, expanding the moment beyond just the two of them. Officer, he said calmly, turning just enough toward the man with the notebook. Make a note of the call classification and the outcome. And that was when the second layer settled in, quiet but heavy, because this was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was documentation, official, recorded, something that did not disappear when the lights went off and the cars pulled away. And the officer gave a quick, firm nod, pen moving again with a different kind of purpose now, not casual observation, but formal entry, and Linda saw it, really saw it this time, her eyes flicking to the notebook again, then back to Hayes, the realization finally landing in full. Not just that she had lost control of this situation, but that she had created something that would follow her beyond tonight. Is that really necessary? She asked, voice lower, stripped of its earlier certainty, and Hayes met her gaze without hesitation. Accuracy in reporting is always necessary, he replied, tone unchanged, and there was no room left to argue with that, no angle to pivot, no authority she could invoke to override it, because the system she had tried to use was now being applied to her, exactly as it was designed to be. And the older officer closed his notebook with a soft snap, looking between the chief and Linda, then back toward me. We will be clearing the scene, he said, professional, neutral, but the message was clear. There was nothing here that justified their presence anymore, nothing except the record of how they got here. And Hayes gave a small nod, then turned slightly toward me, just enough for our eyes to meet for a second, and there was a hint of something there, not approval, not acknowledgement in any obvious way, just a quiet understanding, like two people who both knew how this had been set up long before the sirens ever sounded. And then he looked back to Linda one last time. If you have ongoing concerns, I recommend addressing them through proper community channels rather than emergency services, he said, measured, direct, and that was the closest thing to a closing statement she was going to get. and she nodded, almost automatically, not because she agreed, but because there was nothing else left to do. Her earlier presence, that controlled, commanding energy she carried into the driveway, now reduced to something smaller, quieter, contained. And as the officers began to move back toward their vehicles, the red and blue lights still pulsing, but already feeling less intense, less dominant, I could feel the tension unwind, not all at once, but in layers, like a pressure valve slowly releasing, conversations behind me starting to pick back up in low voices. Someone inside the garage reaching over to turn the music down just a notch, not because they had to, but because the moment called for it. And I stayed where I was for another second, watching as Linda turned away without another word, her steps quicker now, less deliberate, retreating back toward the neat lines of her property. And it hit me then, clear and simple. She did not just call the police tonight. She called the system, and for the first time, it answered her with the truth instead of the control she expected. The patrol cars pulled away slow, one after the other, their lights fading from harsh flashes to distant glows, then to nothing at all, leaving the street in that familiar quiet again, the kind that feels different after something has just happened, like the air itself remembers. And for a few seconds nobody inside the garage said anything, not because they were unsure, but because they were processing it, the way a room settles after tension breaks. And then someone let out a low whistle. Another voice muttered something under their breath, half impressed, half relieved, and the music came back up just slightly, not loud, just enough to fill the space again, like easing back into normal instead of forcing it. And I stepped back inside, the concrete floor cool under my boots, the smell of oil and grilled food grounding everything back where it belonged. And for a moment I just stood there, taking it in, the same space, the same people, but with a different weight now, because what had just happened was not about winning an argument. It was about something deeper, something quieter, and I glanced over to where Chief Hayes had been standing, but he was already moving, picking up his bottle from the workbench like nothing about the last 10 minutes required acknowledgement, like he had not just shifted the entire direction of the night with a few measured sentences. And that was the thing about real authority. It does not linger, it does not need recognition, it just shows up, does what it has to do, and moves on. And as he passed me, he gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable if you were not paying attention, and I returned it just as subtly, because there was nothing to say that had not already been understood. And behind us, conversations picked up again, someone joking about noise levels, another person shaking their head like they had just watched something they would be telling for weeks, and outside, a few porch lights flicked off one by one as neighbors retreated back into their routines, their curiosity satisfied, their assumptions quietly adjusted. And across the street, Linda's house stayed dark, no movement, no presence, just a still frame where control used to stand, and I could almost picture her inside, going over the moment again, replaying it, trying to find the point where it slipped, where the narrative stopped responding to her direction. But the truth was simple, it slipped the second she assumed she understood the system better than the people who actually operated it. And I walked over to the speaker, lowering the volume just a touch, not because I had to, but because balance matters, and I leaned against the workbench again, the same spot from earlier, only now the weight was gone, replaced by something steady, something earned. And it hit me then, clear and quiet. This was never about the music, or the cars, or even the garage. It was about control, about who gets to define what is acceptable and who gets to enforce it. And tonight that line had been drawn in a way that did not need shouting, did not need escalation, just clarity. And as I took another slow sip, the taste of cold beer cutting through the last trace of tension, I realized something else. She thought she was calling power into my space, but what she actually did was expose the difference between borrowed authority and the real thing. And once you see that difference, you cannot unsee it. The night settled into something quieter after that, not silent, but balanced, like everything had found its place again without needing to be forced. The music low and steady, conversation softer now, more intentional, like everyone understood the line that had just been drawn and respected it without being told. And I leaned back against the workbench, fingers resting on the cool edge of steel, watching the garage breathe again. The same space I had built piece by piece, the same space someone tried to take control of with a phone call and a story that did not hold up under light. And it was strange how fast things shifted once the truth was actually measured, not by opinion, not by tone, but by someone who knew exactly where the lines were and why they mattered. And I could still hear Hayes' words in the back of my mind. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear, the kind that does not echo but stays. And I glanced toward the open garage door, out to the street where everything looked normal again, like nothing had happened. But I knew better, because moments like that do not leave marks you can see from the outside. They change how people move, how they think, how they choose their next step, and somewhere across the street, behind those closed blinds, Linda Crawford was sitting with a version of the night she could not rewrite, a version where the system she leaned on did not bend, did not amplify her voice, but instead reflected it back exactly as it was. And that kind of clarity has a way of sticking. And I took another slow breath, the air carrying that mix of oil, wood, and faint smoke from the grill, grounding, familiar mine. And I realized something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with this space. Control is not about volume. It is not about who speaks first or who calls first. It is about understanding where the real boundaries are and standing inside them without flinching. And that is what she never saw. She thought authority was something you could summon, something you could point at and direct. But tonight proved something different. It showed that real authority does not respond to noise. It responds to truth, and truth does not need to raise its voice to be heard. And as the night carried on, the small group inside the garage settling back into easy conversation, someone laughing quietly near the cooler, someone else tapping a rhythm against the workbench, I felt that steady calm settle in deeper than before, not because anything had been won, but because nothing had been taken. And that is the difference people like her never understand. They think control is about changing what belongs to someone else, when in reality it is about knowing exactly what cannot be changed and holding that line without ever needing to shout. And as I stood there, looking out into the dark street that had already moved on, I knew one thing for sure. She thought she made a call that night, but what she really did was answer a question she did not even realize was being asked. And the answer was simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. Some lines do not move just because you say they should, and some people do not need to prove anything when they already stand on the right side of them.